Hello and welcome back to Empyrion Galactic Survival. My name is Spanj. Today I want to talk to you about something called Reforged Eden. Now many of you will know exactly what I'm talking about, but I bet there's a few of you out there that probably have no idea what Reforged Eden is. I've been talking about it, and it's something that I've done a series on before, and I just want to sort of introduce a lot of you guys that possibly have never seen this before to what the hell I'm talking about. First thing to do, head over to the workshop, because Reforged Eden is actually a scenario. It's like a mod, but they're called scenarios in Empyrion land. Now the workshop is where you get most of this stuff from, and if you scroll down on the main workshop page here, you can see there are scenario filters. Just go ahead and hit up the single player one, and this will give you the sort of most popular scenarios in a week. Now Reforged Eden is usually somewhere on the first page here. And in fact, there it is. And you can go ahead and click on that and then hit subscribe. Now, before you do that, Reforged Eden is about to have a massive update to it. At the time of this video, it's not out yet, but hopefully in the next few days after this video, it will be a huge new update by the author, Revian. Now, Reforged Eden is actually the combination of two separate scenarios. Project Eden by Revian and Reforged Galaxy by Vermilion. And together they make Reforged Eden. Now, other than the huge amount of content that Project Eden brings to this scenario, Reforged Galaxy by Vermilion turns a lot of the game on its head in terms of how much thrust a thruster gives, how much power a generator powers, how heavy a fuel tank is, hell, how heavy everything is. He has gone through the config files with a fine-tooth comb and adjusted the values of everything. And that changes how you have to build in Reforged Galaxy and subsequently Reforged Eden. Also with Reforged Eden, Project Eden by Revian, he has added a number of new weapon systems, new blocks, and things like that as well. As has Vermilion with Reforged Galaxy, so combining the two, you get a huge number of new blocks, new weapons, new physics, I suppose, with the different engines and masses, as well as all the new content, POIs, mission stories, and everything in between. It is a huge mod for Empyrion Galactic Survival, and in my personal opinion, it outshines the vanilla game by some miles. Now, Reforged Eden means that you do need to adapt how you build things. Like I say, it does change how thrusters work. But it is similar enough to vanilla that you can easily adapt existing ships to the Reforged Eden requirements. And like I've done here, build entire new fleets just for Reforged Eden. So I'm going to go through now some of the sort of points on what you need to think about when you're building for Reforged Eden. Now, this is quite a tricky little subject. There's a lot of factors and a lot of things to go through. I could spend an entire series going through the differences, the subtle differences and the nuances between Reforged Eden and the vanilla game. But I'm going to try and summarize some of the main points, hopefully to help you guys get started building for this mod. The main thing I think you need to realize is CPU. CPU is handled differently in Reforged Eden to how it is in vanilla, as well as you expect everything is. Of course, though, the mod doesn't change some of the graphics of the UI, and so in the CPU statistics, we still get this kind of 1, 2, 4 setup for the CPU extensions. You need to ignore this. This diagram, just throw it out the window. It exists there because the UI hasn't been changed, and that's it. It is misleading. The way that CPU works in Reforged is you get a certain amount of CPU points available depending on how many extenders you add to your ship. Now, you can add up to 5 tier 4 CPU extenders. That will typically net you 2.1 million CPU points. Now, you can see this in the tier 1 CPU line here, the one that's highlighted in yellow. Ignore tier 2, 3, and 4. They do not apply they are again misleading. 2.1 million CPU is the max amount of CPU you can have using standard CPU extenders. And it applies, like I said, by the number of extensions you add, not by the sequence that you add. You do not need to add them in 2s and 4s. You can have one tier 3 extender. You don't need to have 2 for them to work. I hope that kind of makes sense. It's really difficult to explain, but in essence, if you have a ship that only uses 500,000 CPU points, you would only need to add one extender to get it to 500,000. You won't need to add 2 for it to count. Vanilla, you have to add 2 tier 3 extenders in order for you to unlock the tier 3 amount of CPU. Well, Vermilion didn't like that. And you could just add a CPU extender and you'll get a bit more CPU. Add another extender and you'll get a bit more. Add another and you'll get a bit more. Up to, it is still, I believe, 2 tier 3 CPU extenders is the max you can have, and 5 tier 4 CPU extenders is the max you can have. If you need to go over that maximum 2.1 million CPU, then you need to start looking for something called quantum CPU cores. Okay, and they are obtained in loot throughout the world in various places. If you can get quantum or auxiliary CPU cores, then you can extend your CPU even more. These things will give you 200,000 CPU each. The auxiliaries, I think, give you a little bit more, but these things are hard to come by. They you have to go out and kill very dangerous enemies to get these things. So you already need a ship capable of fighting stuff in order to start farming those things. So it is a bit of a sort of grind fest, I suppose. But it is very, very much possible. It is very much doable. As I sort of proved in the last series, albeit I did have help in order to speed things up for the series, you can get some very, very nice ships full of functionality with the base CPU. You do not need quantum cores. The Ventress here is entirely without quantum cores. And she is a very, very capable vessel. She's not the fightiest of ships, but from everything to hangar bay space, storage, production, some fighty capabilities, she's very, very capable, and that is all within the standard CPU. 2.1 million CPU doesn't sound like a lot compared to the vanilla's 10 million that it gives you, but one of the other key differences that Reforged Eden gives you is blocks do not count to CPU. So blocks do not consume CPU. In vanilla, placing a block it consumes X amount of CPU. We look inside the CPU statistics of the Ventress here, we can see all the hull totals up here. The hull total is 0 for CPU. None of these blocks consume CPU allowance. Everything else does. Thrusters, turrets, generators, constructors, all of that consumes CPU. Armor lockers don't, landing gears don't, elevator frames don't, sensors and signals don't, ventilators don't. All these indoor plants don't. Interestingly, computer consoles do, but, you know, by a tiny little amount. So there we go. CPU completely rewritten in Reforged Eden. Remembering that and working within that, you can still get some very impressive vessels within the CPU system. Now, just because blocks do not consume CPU doesn't mean that you can go absolutely wild with the amount of blocks. Because some of the other things that Vermilion has done with Reforged is increase the weight of some of these blocks and decrease the amount of thrust that your thrusters give. Now, if I was to take the Vendetta here into vanilla, she would be so overpowered in the thruster department, it would be ridiculous. But in Reforged, the amount of thrusters I've got on her here is actually somewhat underwhelming. The Vendetta is good enough with maneuverability. And that's it. You know, we just got 2 XL thrusters on the back of a reasonably small ship. Because she needs that extra thrust in order to move her and give her the sort of performance that she needs. But adding those extra large thrusters, or advanced thrusters as they're known in Reforged land, consumes 800,000. 800,000 of my 2.1 million CPU allocation. So one thing it does force you to do is to really think and prioritize about the builds. In vanilla, you can pretty much throw a build together, place thrusters, and as many guns as you want, and you'll probably be within the 10 million CPU. In Reforged, you really have to curtail that freedom and cut back on placement of thrusters, guns, armor, things like that. The more armor you have, the heavier ship, the slower it'll move, the more thrust you'll need, and before you know it, you run out of CPU. So, you need to think about what is your ship's purpose? What is it supposed to do? Now, my little fleet here that I built for Reforged, each one of these ships has an individual purpose. Now, the Pioneer here, once it's done being a starter CV, it turns into a mining ship. As a starter CV, it has no armor whatsoever. It has some very limited amount of production facilities within it, but it's enough to get going, and it's enough as a starter ship to get yourself off a planet and be upgraded and so on and so forth. But get it in a fight and you can kiss it goodbye. Because it's nothing. It hasn't got the thrust power to have armor, and so that's where I've kind of sacrificed parts of the ship's functionality in order to satisfy other parts of the functionality. I needed to move, I needed to carry stuff, and I needed to build stuff and survive in. It's a mobile base, but I don't need it to fight things. I'm not at that stage yet. That's what you got to think about when you're dealing with a starter ship or any ship in the Reforged build scheme. The Ventress here is my main boat. For a while, she was my main ship. And again, with the Ventress, very, very, very difficult balance of functionality, armor, firepower, and maneuverability. Something I'm very happy to report that I pulled off quite nicely with the Ventress. She has excellent production, excellent storage, decent thrust, and the ability to shoot out drones and small fighty craft and survive a hit or two in the process. That was a very, very difficult build. The Vendetta here's sole purpose is to shoot stuff. That's it. She doesn't even take that much damage in return. She can, but she primary functionality is take stuff on the shield and then get the hell out of dodge and do as much damage in a short time as possible. All the turrets are forward facing. There is an excellent firing solution to this thing. She has no production facilities, no medical facilities, no storage, all guns and engines, okay? And that has maxed out my CPU on that thing. The ground pounder here, which is actually a vanilla build that I was successfully modified for Reforged, utilizes some of the new features of Reforged. Atmospheric turrets, laser turrets fire in atmosphere, great for taking out shields. Heavy turrets do more damage, consume a little bit more CPU. In this case, this went over by a bit. We have a maximum of 2.3 million CPU in this particular version because I've taken the auxiliary cores out of it for the blueprint. This thing will need auxiliary cores to work. And as you can see, if you're familiar with my vanilla ground pounder, the engines in the side and the rear are mediums. In order for this thing to work, even hover on a 1G planet, they needed to be upgraded to large and extra large thrusters. That's the difference. Do you want a prime example of the difference between vanilla and Reforged? This ground pounder and the vanilla ground pounder, you can see it. In fact, I might even be able to bring the vanilla one in just to show you now. That's the original. Okay. The original, all the thrusters are mediums, apart from the large lifting thrusters. So, a massive difference in the amount of thrusters required just to get this thing to move. Just to get it to move forward, I had to tear the back out and put an XL in the back. That's how much difference there is between the amount of thrust vanilla gives you and how much Reforged gives you. So the ground pounder's functionality, very clear. Take out a heavy beating on the belly, tank things with a shield, and destroy stuff from above. Very, very useful for taking out ground targets, as it always has been. The Vulture here. The Vulture's armored a bit like a starter CV, but its primary purpose, as you can tell by the size of the thrusters that it has on its belly, is to lift things off of heavy, high-gravity planets. That's it. That's its job. It has a few guns on it to protect it while it does that job. But essentially, it's a dropship for high-gravity planet. It has no production facilities. It has a fair bit of storage because you need to get things off of a high-gravity planet. So there we go. And obviously the Valkyrie down here is just an example of what actually is capable within Reforged Eden. You might be thinking, well, okay, I don't want a ship that is so limited. I want to have one ship that can do it all. Well, you can still do that, but you better be ready to pay for it. Because as I sort of already mentioned, you're going to need quantum cores coming out the wazoo if you want to be doing something like that. The Valkyrie here is a prime example of the ridiculous. And, you know, you need 72 quantum cores to do it. So that's 72 legacy decimators. And that's assuming that 72 legacy decimators actually drops a quantum core, because sometimes they don't. That's the grind. That's the kind of grind you need to do for something like this. It is possible, but you're going to have to pay for it. Now, of course, if you are resourceful enough and damage determined enough to bring something like the Valkyrie in here, then you deserve it. You really do deserve to have a ship that can do it all. The Valkyrie here is fast. She's reasonably maneuverable. She has so very much firepower and more armor than a Tavera could eat through in a day and a half. You know, this thing face-hugged a Tavera and didn't even break a sweat doing it. There is so much Xenosteel armor in here, it would keep it busy for a very long time. And in return, shoot the living bejesus out of it. So yes, you can have a ship that does it all, but you're going to have to pay for it. In the meantime, you're going to need a small fleet of vessels, each specializing in their own little ways. Now, there is no easy way to tell you how to build in Reforged. For me, it was a lot of trial and error. It is relearning how to build in Empyrion as if somebody had changed all the rules, which is exactly what Vermilion has done. However, now that you know about the CPU differences, the difference in the amount of thrusters that you're going to need in order to move stuff, and the weight differences in blocks and stuff like that, hopefully you have a better idea now of how to prioritize your build in such a way that you can actually produce something. Now, there are amazing additions to Reforged. Solar panels on CVs, as you can see on the Ventress here, are a wonderful little thing. Park your CV near a star and let the solar batteries keep things like your garden and your fridges running while you go off and do some random shenanigans. Not to mention as well the heavy turrets. Heavy turrets. Now, they require a little RNG loot, but they're very much worth the extra firepower. You can also install Xerex turrets and legacy turrets that you find out in the wild onto your ships. Plus, crew actually has a function in Reforged. Crew contribute CPU points to your allocation. Not very much, 2,000. But it's better than nothing. All that CPU stuff, all the blocks, thrusters, changes, and everything applies through CVs, HVs, and SVs as well. Generally, the more firepower, the more sort of resilience, firepower, maneuverability, survivability you give a ship, the higher the CPU cost is going to be. If you can trim it down to a bare minimum functionality, what do you need this ship to do? Then you can get a ship to do that within the CPU allocation in Reforged. Otherwise, thruster placement is basically the same as vanilla. The more you put it into the corners of the ship, the better performance you are going to get out of it. The more cargo you want to lift, the more thrusters you're going to need. As always, when you are building, the statistics page on the control panel is your friend. to figure out what your cargo lift capacity is, how much thrust in meganewtons you've got, etc. You know, a good acceleration speed for a CV is anything above sort of 10, really, in Reforged. Expect your CVs to move a lot slower. It's fine. It's fine. It's normal. All of my builds here are available on the workshop, so if you want to bring them into a game and see how they are put together, please do so. Tear them apart, modify them if you want, for your own needs. See how they tick. There's a link to my workshop in the video description down below. Okay, so if you're ready to start building for Reforged Eden, how on earth do you go about doing that? Because standard creative mode will load you into vanilla. Now that we've subscribed to Reforged Eden on the workshop, just go ahead and start a new game, single player, select scenario, and then select Reforged Eden. Go ahead and sort out some difficulty settings, planet locations, whatever, new game, whatever you like, and then go ahead and click start. Now you'll appear on the ground like a normal survival game, either in an escape pod or whatever means, whatever start you selected. What you can do is just go ahead and hit open the console with the tilde key and type in CM for change mode, and this will change it from survival to creative. You can then do CM again to change it back again. Once you're in creative mode, you can use all the usual tools like the item menu. The blueprints will be set to spawn, so you can spawn anything in, and you could use GM in the console to enable God mode so you can fly around like a crazy person. And there we go. You're in creative mode, but you're in Reforged Eden. You have access to all of the toys that Reforged Eden brings you, including the heavy turrets for bases, CVs, SVs, and so on and so forth. The bomb launchers, alien turrets and stuff. So you can really go nuts with anything you want to build. You have access to the quantum CPU extenders and things like that, so you can see how many you're gonna need in order to get that ship you want actually working. I'm not going to lie to you, building for Reforged is one of the hardest challenges there is for a builder, I think. Building a starter CV is even harder. You have limited CPU available to you, and you need a CV that can do most things in order to get you the best start game. The Pioneer here was definitely a challenge, but I managed to get her into a decent state. Certainly one that can be upgraded as well is a very big benefit, because in Reforged you're going to be on the hunt for materials, extensions and things like that to increase your CPU, and you're not necessarily going to have the materials and stuff in order to build an entirely new ship. So you're going to want something to start you off that's affordable, but that you can add things to later. My best advice for building something like that is to build it in creative mode and just build it to the best possible spec for that ship. The Pioneer here could go up to a reasonable sort of tier 3 kind of level before it runs out of space, really. For example, by default it does not come with a shield generator. However, there is a space for one. By default, it doesn't come with secondary generators, but there is space for it. It doesn't come with large ammo containers, but there is space. More fuel tanks, but there is space. And so on and so forth. So if you can incorporate into an early game design ability to upgrade it, then I think you'll be very happy with the ship you build. Just remember to also allow spaces for extra thrusters, because the more you expand a ship, the heavier it will get, and the more thrust you will need in order for that thing to move. The advanced Pioneer, once it had gone through several versions of upgrades, required large thrusters on the back for it to move. There you go. That's what it looks like once it's had numerous updates. Large thrusters that are out of a line. Because, yeah, that annoyed a lot of people. Sorry, guys. Anyway. Extra guns, extra thrusters, mining drills, extra storage. all within the starter CV. If you can do that, then you can build anything in Reforged, because that is the biggest challenge that you'll face initially. I hope you found this helpful. I'm not sure how helpful it will be. It's such a difficult concept to communicate and do a video on without just building something, which of course I've done during various live streams and things like that over the course of several hours. Not something to easily compress into a quick YouTube video, believe me. Still, I hope this has been useful. Remember, CPU in Reforged is king. So just remember that you get more CPU for each CPU extender you add. It is not the 1, 2, 4 method that the vanilla game uses. I'm at real risk of just repeating myself again, so I think that is going to be the video. Once again, do check out Reforged Eden on the workshop. It is available now, but there is a huge update just about to be released for it, so if you can hold off a little while longer before spinning it up, I think you will be very happy with the result. Ladies and gentlemen, Reforged Eden, a new series starting soon. I've actually got a build challenge going on over at my Discord at the moment, where I am taking your builds and I will be using them in my upcoming series of Reforged Eden. They are being voted on by patrons, Twitch subs, and YouTube members, but anyone can submit a build. All the details are on my Discord server. Get involved if you want to promote your build. If you want me to use your build in the upcoming Let's Play, then get involved over on my Discord link, as always, down below in the video description. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you found it useful, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.